It's my pleasure today to introduce Jens Ludwig, who's the Edwin and Betty Bergman Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago. He's also the Pritzker Director of the University of Chicago's Crime Lab. Jens has been studying gun violence for over 2 decades and has done, some of the most influential work on, rational, dispassionate work about thinking about the ways that we can reduce gun violence and the problems of gun violence. And I think it's, a real pleasure that we get to hear from him. This book, Unexpected Origins of Gun Violence, Unforgiving Places, is going to be out next week, I believe. So those of you here have your, you're getting the first copies of the book. They're in the back, and Jens, after the talk, I'm sure we'll be happy to sign a few copies as well. Last thing I would just say is, Jens is going to give a talk. I'm gonna ask some questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So one of the things I'd just say, though, in reading over the book is I think you'll be fascinated by the arguments that he's making. They aren't the conventional arguments people make in the area of thinking about what to do about gun violence. And they are arguments that are rooted in science. The book has a little bit of everything in it, from psychology to economics, to criminology, to history, to real-life case studies, and even some of Jens' personal experiences driving and visiting places. So without further ado, Jens Ludwig.
Thanks so much, John. Thanks everybody for coming. It's always so great to come to the University of Pennsylvania. I grew up in South Jersey, exit 4. I'm a Mount Laurel kid. When I was in high school at Lenape High School in Medford, I desperately wanted to go to the University of Pennsylvania more than anything. And my parents are immigrants, and they said, guess what we forgot to do? Save for college. Have you seen what? And so I've always been an aspirational University of Pennsylvania alumnus. So it's great to be back. Let me see, what am I? Okay, so as John mentioned, this is a book that is just coming out. It summarizes the work that we've been doing at this research center that I help run at the University of Chicago. What we've learned working very closely with city government and nonprofits around Chicago about the gun violence problem, what causes it, what you might do to solve it, that I think has led us to think about the problem in a very different way. And hopefully you guys will find this interesting. This is the problem so let me just start off by describing the problem that has brought us here. So the bar, you can see I made this slide myself because it's incompetently labeled. You can't even see what the United States is the bar to the left there. Our murder rate per capita is literally unheard of among any rich country in the world. Even countries that you do not think of as like particularly well governed countries like Turkey are looking at the United States and thinking, what the fuck is going on in the United States? Like, it really is just so exceptional among other rich countries. And if I color in now the share of these murders that are committed with guns versus non-guns, you can see that it's really murders committed with firearms that is the thing that makes America exceptional. Right? That is and when you look at surveys of the public, of the part of the crime problem they're worried about, gun violence is the crime problem in America. So this is something that I learned from a wonderful paper that Aaron wrote many years ago with Justin McCrary. Like, this is the crime problem from people's perspective. So how have we been thinking about gun violence historically? This is some survey data about what Americans say when you ask them what causes crime. And let me just, let's just look at the last column there, 1994. This is around the time that Bill Clinton is signing the crime bill, the largest crime bill in US history. And you can see, 30% of people say crime is due to crisis of personal values, 20% say Americans tend to think of drug use as a moral failure. This is just observing what people tend to think. 20% think it's a wimpy criminal justice system. Effectively, at the time that Clinton is signing the crime bill, 70% of Americans think that crime is due to characterologically bad people or the failure of the criminal justice system to solve them. That has been one of the two dominant conventional wisdoms. And to the extent to which there's another conventional wisdom that people tend to gravitate towards, it's gun violence is due to root causes, things like poverty and unemployment. So that is basically how everybody has been thinking about the problem, but especially that the problem is due to bad people. That's where the mass of the public has been for a long time. And if you think that gun violence is due to incorrigibly bad people, then it's a very short step to conclude that there really is only one solution to the gun violence problem, which is to lock people up. Okay. And we can ask how that has been going. And it turns out that the United States is very good at locking people up. We have the highest prison population of any country in the world. As everybody in this room knows, we have massive racial disparities in who's behind bars as well. If this was keeping us safe as an exclusive strategy, we could have a conversation, but our murder rate, as we just saw, is completely off the charts. As you can see in this little sub figure in the bottom left here, we also have massive racial disparities in who's the victim of gun violence as well. So I think it is not an exaggeration to say that we kind of have the worst of all worlds. Highest incarceration rate and a murder rate that is unheard of in any rich country. Like, we've got to do better than this. Okay. Now, in thinking about the conventional wisdom, I want to point out that the left and the right in America hate each other and disagree about almost everything. So it's interesting to observe that the conventional wisdom of the left and the conventional wisdom of the right do have something in common, funnily enough, right? The right says, oh, the problem is bad people unafraid of the criminal justice system. So the only thing that we can do is disincentivize that by threatening people with ever stricter prison sentences to deter crime. That basically is assuming that before anyone pulls a trigger, they're kind of rationally, deliberately, in some sort of premeditated way, comparing the pros and cons of doing that. People on the left say, oh, people are pulling triggers because they're economically desperate. They're trying to, economically survive. They're going to do whatever it takes. The only solution is to improve the alternatives to crime so they don't have to do that. Again, that also sort of assumes that people are weighing pros and cons. So the left and the right share the assumption that this is like what Gary Becker would say is like rational, premeditated behavior, right? Carrot, sticks, they're both different sorts of incentives. They assume that this is intentional. And I have come to believe that that is not the right way to think about the gun violence problem. Okay, and so here's a different view of why people commit violence. And let me just describe this by describing a more or less randomly selected shooting from the Chicago Tribune. So this happened in the South Shore neighborhood in Hyde Park. This is a couple miles from my office at the University of Chicago in Hyde Park. And so June 2nd, 2012, for those of you who don't remember, it's a Saturday, 3 p.m. at 73rd and Coles Avenue in South Shore. Two groups of kids are out in the middle of the street arguing about whether a kid in one of the groups stole a bike from a kid in the other group. And then a 17-year-old kid pulls a handgun out of their waistband and fires into the first group. It's a 16-year-old kid in the chest. EMS comes, they race him up Lakeshore Drive to the Northwestern Emergency Department downtown where the kid's pronounced dead. That is what most gun violence is in America. It's not premeditated. It's not over any sort of meaningful economic, like a used bike on the south side of Chicago will get you $10, right? This makes no sense. And even in Chicago, with our crummy criminal justice system, you shoot someone in broad daylight on a crowded street, there is at least a 50-50 chance of getting caught. And in fact, the shooter is now spending, I think, 30 years in a correctional facility in downstate Illinois. Like, it makes no sense from sort of a rational benefit cost perspective. Okay, so what's going on? This is also, the data show that the overwhelming majority of shootings in American cities, this is for Chicago, but in the book I go through for every city that I can get data for, the overwhelming majority of shootings are that. They're arguments, garden variety arguments that escalate and end in tragedy because someone's got a gun. Okay, so what's going on here? So to understand how to prevent this, we've got to have some understanding of like what's going on. Why do people do that? And so what I wanted to do is talk you very quickly through a little audience participation exercise. And so the way this is going to work is I'm going to show you an object and I want you to call out the color of the object in the slide. We'll do a little trial run for starters. Okay, everybody's got okay, here we go. That's pathetic. Here we go. This is only going to forgive my blunt University of Chicago observation that's pathetic. And literally nobody said anything. Okay, we can clearly do much better than much better. Even my undergraduates at Chicago at 8 a.m. classes show more life than that. Here we go. This is only going to work if you guys are really into it. Okay, call out the color of the object. Here, it's only going to work really. Okay, here we go. Okay, so there's been a lot of debate about college admission standards. That's partly a literacy test. Congratulations. So if you've taken a psychology class here at Penn, you will recognize that as something called the Stroop test. It's one of the most widely used experiments in psychology. So what is the Stroop test illustrating? Okay. So if you've taken a psychology class, if you've read Danny Kahneman's wonderful book, Thinking Fast and Slow, you will be aware that there are two types of cognition that our minds engage in. There's the voice in your head that you realize as thinking. Kahneman calls that system 2. That's logical, or it can be logical, but it's slow and very effortful. And it's so slow and so effortful that our minds are designed to not do that very much. Most of what our minds do is something that we're not even aware of, is engage in a bunch of cognition that happens below the threshold of consciousness, a series of unconscious automatic responses that we develop that are adaptive to things, to routine things that we see over and over again. So in the Stroop test, it's like we see the word. When you see a piece of text, pen on a sweatshirt, I don't deliberately, consciously think to myself, what are the pros and cons of reading somebody's sweatshirt? I just read it, right? So in life, you see word over and over, you've developed an adaptive automatic response that you just read it without even, it's almost involuntary. That normally adaptive system 1 response, what the Stroop test is illustrating is that can lead to problems when it's overgeneralized, right? So it's not that the system 1 response is bad, it's that once in a while you will come across an out of the ordinary situation and deploy your system 1 and you'll overgeneralize it, it'll cause problems. So what does that have to do with gun violence? Well, we know, unfortunately, from a large body of sociological research, from going around Chicago talking to teachers and social workers and community violence interruption organizations over and over. We know that in many under-resourced neighborhoods in American cities, Chicago, but not just Chicago, the institutions of informal social control are overwhelmed. And so kids learn very quickly that when you get challenged on the street, right? If somebody comes up and asks you for your lunch money, if you give in and you give it to them, tomorrow they're coming back and asking for your jacket. The day after that, they're taking your phone. So kids system 1 learn very quickly that the adaptive automatic response to being challenged, because you're basically on your own. There are no adults, like the adults in the neighborhood are overwhelmed. There are no adults that you can go to for help. So when you're challenged, you fight back. And notice the degree to which you fight back need not be proportional to the provocation, because it is not retribution for what someone just did. It is forward-looking signaling that you're not someone to be messed with, okay? So response of whatever, push back hard as a signal that normally might work well for kids, but leads to tragedy when someone's got a gun. Okay, that is the behavioral economics perspective that we've gravitated towards around gun violence. So this is very sophisticated University of Pennsylvania audience. You should be thinking to yourself, this is an interesting story, but all you've done so far is tell me a story. And I would say one of the other kind of meta reasons we haven't made more progress on this problem is there's just too much talking, storytelling, and not enough evidence. And so we carried out a randomized experiment to test this hypothesis with a amazing Chicago nonprofit called Youth Guidance. The program that we studied is called Becoming a Man. And so the very first exercise, this is with middle school, high school age male students, some of the highest violence South and West Side Chicago neighborhoods, 12 kids in a group. They do this during once a week. They get out of a class to do this in school. They pair the kids up. So like the first exercise, the fist, John and I would be paired up. They'd give me a rubber ball. They'd say to John, you have 30 seconds to get the ball out of Jens's hand. The only rule is that there are no rules. And what John will do is basically just beat the crap out of me for 30 seconds. He'll try and pry open my hand. He'll break my pinky. That won't work. He'll put me in a headlock. He'll punch me in the stomach. He'll bite my ear. The program counselor will call time. give the ball to John. I do the same thing to John. Then they reconvene and do a debrief. And the program counselor then will turn to John and say, what strategies did you try to get the ball? And John will say, well, first I tried to pry his hand open. He's stronger than he looks, and blah, blah, blah. And then the program counselor will say to John, why didn't you ask for the ball? Because youth guidance has now done BAM with, I think, something like 10,000 kids in Chicago. And they tell me that like literally not more than one or two handfuls of kids out of 10,000 ever ask for the ball. And then John will respond by saying something like, oh, if I would have asked, Jens would have thought I was, and you could imagine what the kids say then, right? And then the program counselor will turn to me and say, Jens, what would you have done if John had asked for the ball? And I'd say, it's just a stupid rubber ball. It's much better than having my pinky broken, this creepy guy bite my ear, whatever it is, right? So you can see what BAM is doing there is it's not ending poverty. It's not threatening people with stiffer sentences. It is teaching people that your system one can overgeneralize and that it's really important in high-stakes situations to deploy system two to put a check on that. Like system two is sort of the fact checker for system one. Okay, so we did this RCT and we found that there was a 45%, so this is like 10 to 15 contact hours for kids, 45% reduction in violent crime arrests. These cannot be quote unquote super predators if giving them 10 to 15 hours of programming cuts their risk of violence in half. We're a bunch of economists. We were like, this can't possibly be. So we did it again and we found a 50% reduction in violent crime. This does not make sense under conventional wisdom, right? So whether or not you believe my explanation for what's going on, you should at the very least walk away concluding that conventional wisdom does a terrible job at explaining the gun violence problem. Okay, so here's what I think is sort of the big idea behind the book, is that our public policies have thought of the problem of gun violence as exclusively a system two problem. And I think it is much more of a system one problem than we've appreciated. That, I hope, is the big pivot in our thinking moving forward here. And I would just also point out maybe just a couple last observations, and then John can ask me questions, you guys can ask me questions. The one other thing that I would just point out is this behavioral economics perspective also gives us a way to understand why a bunch of other things out in the criminological literature that look super disconnected actually work, okay? So let's take, the work of Aaron and many others on why police reduce crime. Like, if I ask someone in an economics department or someone on Sansom Street, why do police reduce crime? They'll say some version of incapacitation or deterrence. So you will be surprised to learn. So I believe Aaron's paper that more cops reduce crime. I also believe the data that I see from the Chicago Police Department that, does anyone want to guess how many arrests a year the average Chicago cop makes? 3. 3 arrests on average per officer. Maybe there's tons of deterrence being generated by 3 arrests per cop per year, but it's also possible that what cops are basically doing is interrupting violence, at least sometimes, as part of what they do, right? That's why is everybody interested in violence interruption, right? Under conventional wisdom, that makes no sense. That's not ending poverty. That's not threatening people with, but it is interrupting conflict before it escalates. The system one perspective on violence would suggest that the motivation for violence is fleeting, so violence interrupted really might be violence prevented rather than merely delayed. Why do sociologists think that collective efficacy matters so much, right? Why does cleaning up vacant lots matter? Behavioral economics gives you a way to see, like, to the outside, it's almost like, imagine trying to understand COVID without understanding the germ theory of disease. Like, preventing COVID with masks and social distancing and vaccine, you're like, this makes no sense. This gives us a way to think about it, okay? It's also Jane Jacobs' Eyes on the Street. She was writing about this 60 years ago. Urban planning, criminology, sociology, like all of this stuff then starts to have a coherent underlying explanation. It also gives us a sense for why some things don't work. I have a paper out recently that shows that income transfers and jobs programs, even changes in overall poverty rates and macroeconomic conditions, do change property offending, but don't change violent crime. This gives us a way to understand why that is. Okay, the final thing that I just wanted to say, maybe this is an audience that doesn't, well, this is the Penn Urban group, and so let me just make a pitch for those of you who care about cities but don't spend a lot of time worrying about crime to worry even about more crime, worry more about crime than you do. I have become convinced that gun violence really does sit upstream of almost every other social problem that cities face. So my University of Chicago colleague Steve Levitt wrote a paper a couple years ago showing that every murder that happens in a city reduces the city's population by fully 70 people. Fewer people coming in, more people moving out, okay? This graph shows you the trend in population. Obviously, there are lots of things that affect city population, but I'm going to argue that gun violence is an important thing. So this shows city populations for New York and Detroit benchmarked as a fraction of the city's 1950 population. You'll see 1980, 1990, New York City was a very rough place. Population was down 10%. As you all know, New York City became massively safe. Population surged by 20%. New York City is a thriving city now. Detroit, on the other hand, Detroit has had a lot of challenges, but it's also the case that Detroit is consistently one of the most violent cities in the United States. Detroit has lost fully 2/3 of its population since 1950. And if you've been reading about Detroit, you realize that population loss has been hugely damaging to Detroit's ability to do anything effectively, to deliver any sort of effective public services on any front, from education to trash collection to anything, you name it. And I think the thing that I want to leave you with is I'm going to show you where Chicago falls next, but I want to argue that there are many, many cities like Chicago. I would guess that Philadelphia is in the same boat, and on around the country, that really are kind of on the knife's edge of which direction they're going to go. So the high-level sort of summary for this idea is I was in the juvenile detention center a few years ago, and one of the staff members in there, he said, look, 20% of the kids in here are dangerous. You let them out, they're going to hurt other people. We have to keep them locked up. But the other 80%, I always tell them, if I could give you back just 10 minutes of your lives, you wouldn't be here. And I think that's kind of the big mindset shift that I hope the book helps engender. I hope you guys like reading it, and I really look forward to your reactions and your questions. Thanks so much again for coming.
Excellent. I'll just ask a couple questions. You gave us a bit of the theoretical underpinning to your book. Can you, thinking about the rise and fall in gun violence, the rise that started in March 2020 in pretty much every major city, and then the fall that's happened really in the last, say, year and a half. What does that say to you about kind of the system one idea?
Great question. I think one way to think about the crime trends, or one of the ways that I've been thinking about the crime trends through this lens, is not in isolation, but against the backdrop of lots of other patterns that we've been seeing. So like motor vehicle deaths have gone crazy since COVID. I'm old enough to remember 2019, pre-COVID, when you wouldn't be seeing videos all over the place of people punching each other out on airplanes. I don't know if you all remember 6 years ago, that was not really a thing. And now it's its own genre of TikTok. People doing insane things on planes, right? And so I think what COVID did is put people much more on edge. And it's sort of very consistent with this idea that you've got way more people on edge, and the gun violence problem is very, very driven by altercations rather than economically motivated things. And there you have it.
So also, if you think about during COVID, like there was a huge income transfer, right? People actually got a reasonable amount of money. Property crime didn't go up. People were at home, but gun violence seemed to move the total independent direction. So that would at least seem consistent with some of your think.
Yeah, and I think it's also consistent with the idea, like I guess criminologists use the term guardian, or maybe Aaron used the term guardians when I was talking to him before. Like, when you talk to cops, they were like, during the pandemic, they were explicitly told, like, minimize avoidable interactions with people. Community violence interruption organizations, like everybody was doing, like all of our social service infrastructure was shut down, and adults were sitting inside quarantining as we were supposed to. And I think there were just a ton of young people who were like, I'm going out. And there you have it.
In terms of kind of the theory, do you think there's, I see some connections in your, in the Kahneman style theory of, cognition that connects to some classic philosophical ideas like Stoicism in terms of deliberately practicing certain restraints and so forth so that your system one isn't overloaded. Have you thought at all about kind of that maybe these aren't new ideas, these are in some ways old ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is exactly the way that I think of this sort of like behavioral economics framework. Is it gives us a way to make sense of a bunch of things that we've known for a long time. It gives us a way to understand them much more deeply and a way to connect a bunch of dots. So like the Jane Jacobs thing, for instance. Jane Jacobs is writing in The Death and Life of Great American Cities back in 1961 or whatever it is, like, look at the similarly poor neighborhoods in lower Manhattan, similarly poor, but huge differences in violence rates. What in the world is going on? And she's saying, like, it seems like it's eyes on the street, but I talked to Chicago cops. The University of Chicago has hired like private security guards on every street corner. And I talked to Chicago cops that I know, and I'm like, do you think that is literally eyes on the street. I was like, do you think that does any good? And they're like, just more evidence that the University of Chicago is run by idiots, because it's clear that a criminal will just go around the corner or wait for the private security guard. So you can sort of see, it's like that's a very kind of system two perspective on the problem. I'm not surprised that the cops said, I'm not surprised that lots of people look at this. I've heard lots of people say this is just like safety theater from the University of Chicago, but I think now we've got a way to understand why Jane Jacobs was right, why that is like genuinely helpful.
Do you think that there's, that you need, what you're advocating for in the theory suggests that there's a slightly different mechanism when it comes to violence than, say, general property crime? Like, while the University of Chicago could put security guard everywhere, you might still have porch pirates, but it's different from, students being, mugged on the street.
Yeah, I definitely think that, you can already see sort of that, like, here's one sort of high level way to say this, which is like crime might be an unhelpfully broad term. It's almost like, imagine that I've got like a theory of disease or illness or something. You'd be like, I'm not even sure what that means. Like there's cancer, there's like pneumonia, there's COVID. You're telling me that so I think crime is an umbrella over a bunch of like potentially very different sorts of behaviors. You can sort of see this in the differential response to income programs or jobs programs. You can see property crime goes down, violent crime does not. In the book, I talk about this great study that was done in the Stockholm subway, where they rolled out station by station, sort of very nice natural experiment study. They roll out station by station security cameras, and you can see that property offending goes down. Property offending really seems to be motivated by people doing at least some sort of approximation of benefit cost analysis in their heads, but violent crime doesn't change, right? And I think that just speaks to these sort of differential mechanisms and hence different sort of policy levers that you need.
So the last question I have, and I don't want you to give away too much of your book because everyone needs to read the book. You can't go to a talk. You actually have to read the whole thing.
I'll be back in 2 weeks for the quiz.
But I did have a question about, BAM is a good example, and you have a number of examples in the book. But have you thought, broadly about what would be the kind of national, what would be the like infrastructure that you would need to build that would be focused around, informal social control, system one thinking, from a policy perspective. Not that you could completely, there's the social planner in me makes always thinks you can come up with a list, and that's probably not realistic. But what are some kind of big things you think American society could do that would be beneficial?
Yeah, let me answer that in a ruthlessly pragmatic way, because I'm sitting in Chicago looking at news headlines about how Chicago is about to drive off the budget cliff. Since I grew up in the area, I read the Inquirer a bunch. I don't think Philadelphia is in much better financial shape, and so let me tell you what I would do. Let me tell you what I would do in an environment in which I had no money to do anything. Okay. The two things that I would do, the two high-level directions that I would push on if I had no money to do anything, is the first thing that I would do is I would try and infuse these behavioral economic ideas in existing social systems that have tons of low-value time right now, right? And so one example, in the book I talk about this study that we did in the juvenile temporary detentions, where the guy made the 10-minute comment. The kids would go to school. Nancy B. Jefferson is a Chicago public school. They'd go there in the morning. And then in the afternoon, the kids would just sit in the common room watching TV, and there would be a guard standing against the wall just watching them, so there are no problems. And we worked with the administrator of the facility to basically do a BAM-like program with kids in the afternoon. We didn't have any money to hire someone to brought, so they just trained the detention staff to deliver a BAM-like thing. And we thought, for that to be socially helpful, the bar that we have to clear is not the greatest social policy intervention anywhere, but developmentally better than watching TV. And it turns out that we cleared that bar. We structured that like an RCT. Recidivism rates go down by 20%. You might say, I don't know if 20% is a big deal or a small deal. The cost is literally zero. It was the cost of mimeographing books for the kids. That was it, and a week of training for the staff. You give me 5 things that are free and cost 20% deltas, I think I'm really onto something, right? And I don't know why we don't do that. At Lenape High School in Medford, they made me take 4 years of health education. Eat more broccoli, sleep more, don't drink, and here's where babies come from. Yet when you look at the leading health problems for American adolescents, it is homicide, especially in minority communities. It is suicide, it is drug overdoses, and it is motor vehicle accidents. Why do we only need 10 or 15 hours of that health curriculum to do BAM-like things for every kid and save a ton of lives? I don't know why we're not doing it. So that's one sort of thing. It's doesn't take any money. We're wasting a bunch of time in every detention facility in the country, every school in the country. Let's put that time, take the existing people, the existing kids, and do that instead. And the second thing is, if you had lots of money, there'd be a bunch of other things that you can do. But if you don't have any money, the other thing that I would do that far too few cities are currently doing is using data to better position the people you already have in those times and places where conflict is most likely. On the south side of Chicago at 57th and State Street, there's a liquor store that's open until midnight. Every other liquor store in Chicago on the south side closes at 10 at the latest. So up until 10, people from all over the south side are going to their local liquor stores. After 10, between 10 and midnight, people from all sorts of different neighborhoods with different gang affiliations converge to 57th and State. Guess what happens when you look at the data? There's a huge spike in shootings between 10 and midnight at 57th and State on the south side. Now, I realize there's a bunch of controversy about using data and predictive analytics to target, but as a common sense human being, why would we not target either a cop or a community violence intervention person, somebody, to sit at 57th and State from 10 to 12? That is what using data to position our resource. It just seems like a free win that more and more cities, I think, are moving away from rather than moving towards. And that would be the other big thing that I would it's a version of Jane Jacobs's Eyes on the Street in an environment in which you have no money and no time, and summer's around the corner.
All right, great. Open up for questions from the audience, and if you want to use the microphone.
Hello, I'm Dr. Maurice Henderson. I'm the president of the National Men of Color Association and a Penn Community Scholar in public health. So earlier this week, someone from the South Side came in and spoke to us about what it was that they were doing towards public health and violence. What best projects do you see helping out in Chicago right about now, especially particularly with faith-based institutions?
Yeah, I think I think that there's a bunch of nonprofits. So one of the things that we're doing with a bunch of nonprofits on the South Side and the West Side of Chicago is there are a bunch of organizations that are doing their own version of BAM. I think the sort of the jargony term for this is cognitive behavioral intervention. I think is the sort of CBI is like the term du jour for this. And every organization is kind of inventing this themselves, right? It's not like you can go to Amazon and buy the CBI manual that is the equivalent of like the Chicago Manual of Style or something like that. So we're bringing all of the CVI nonprofits from Chicago together to pool their best curriculum ideas to create an open source CBI sort of curriculum that nonprofits all over Chicago can use. But once it's open source and it's on the web, nonprofits that are interested all over the place can use it. And I think that's another example of something like nobody is going to get a huge infusion of money from Washington, D.C. to address the gun violence problem. So you're going to have to be thinking about how can I get more violence prevention out of the resources that I already have, and upgrading the curriculum. I don't know how big that delta will be, but upgrading the curriculum by drawing on the smart, clever insights of other imagine, your curriculum, you have some great ideas and some so-so ideas, and imagine replacing that with a curriculum that has everybody's best ideas. That could turn out to be like a very non-trivial upgrade in the effectiveness of all these organizations. We'll see. We will see, and we'll keep everybody posted on when that. I'll let John know that so he can circulate it once it's online.
Other questions people have, or I'm going to volunteer people for questions. Aaron.
Is it already on? All right. Hey, Jens. Thinking about the message of the book that system one thinking, right, is really salient in driving the bad decisions that lead to serious violence. What are the lessons that we should take away for what the police should do differently, or what the justice system should do differently? And I'm thinking a little bit about a figure that I've seen you present in other talks that you've given. Thinking about the historic crime trends in Chicago versus New York, and you sort of see these very different experiences where New York becomes this very different place, this place with far less violent. Chicago doesn't really, do that. And, are there policy decisions that you think were done differently in different cities that interact with this insight about system one thinking? Or, is it about gun carrying, or is there something else that we should take away?
Yeah, maybe let me focus on a point that you raised yourself in one of your papers. So the paper that I had in the talk about the effects of policing and the racial distribution of consequences. And so one of the findings in Aaron's paper is that when a city hires more police, serious violent crime goes down, which is great. Arrests for serious violent crime go down as well. So that tells you something preventive is happening. That's great. But in some cities, arrests for minor offenses go up, right? And I think part of what's going on is the police may be misunderstanding the production function for public safety, right? I don't know exactly it's been a little bit hard for me to perfectly reverse engineer what they think the production function is, but they think that making a bunch of low-level misdemeanor arrests improves public safety. So this is not an ideological or political statement. It's just like an empirical statement that when you look at the data, that doesn't seem to be the case. So I've written about that. A bunch of other people have written about that as well, right? And I think this behavioral economics perspective helps you sort of understand why those low-level misdemeanor arrests wouldn't be helpful and what you would want to ask your cops to do more generally. Or here's another way to sort of say that, Aaron, as well. This is a little bit different, which is in the domestic violence area, right? One of the big discussions going back to one of Larry Sherman's earliest experiments is when a cop shows up to a domestic violence scene, should they make an arrest or not? And then there's been a bunch of, but we don't really, as far as I know, I'm at the Penn, you guys are the best criminology department in the world. You should correct me if I'm wrong.
We will.
You will. Is like, I don't think that there is a huge active public discussion or scholarly literature about when cops should make arrests more generally. Like all the conversations that I hear about everything in the criminal justice system is people should use their best judgment. I have no idea what the hell that means, right? And so like, you know, I was in the back of let me just give you one example, right? Like I was in the back of a Chicago police car many years ago when a call comes in, huge brawl in the middle of the street. And so like every car in this district turns on the lights and sirens and flies over to the scene. And we show up and I took off I had my contacts in, I took out my pocket protector, trying to blend out my baseball cap and my jeans. So I'm sitting in the back of the car watching, the cops show up, bunch of people in the middle of the street yelling, and the cops get out and they say, everybody shut the fuck up. What's going on? And they say, well, you know, the teenage girl who lives on this side of the street had been dating the teenage boy on that side of the street. They broke up. Somebody decided it would be a good idea to walk across the street, walk into the other person's house and punch someone in the face. And all of a sudden, like the whole thing, it's on. Okay. So thing one from that, right? Thing one from that is like this system one perspective helps you understand what would be helpful and what would not be helpful in that situation. What would not be helpful, if you think of system one motivation as fleeting, like in domestic violence is different. Like sometimes you really need, like domestic violence motivation really may be persistent, right? And so the need for arrest in those circumstances, but for something like this out on the street, it's not clear that this is, you know, this is not going to be a Hatfield and McCoy for 30 years kind of thing where you need to like remove somebody and put them behind bars or there's going to be a shooting tomorrow. You just need to break this thing up in the moment. And so luckily in that case, they didn't arrest anybody, but sometimes the cops might maybe thinking that I'm sure there are a bunch of arrests that are made just because the cop is an asshole, but sometimes there are arrests made earnestly in the belief that they're being helpful, and I think the data would suggest that they're not. And the other thing that I think this example, so we get, you know, the end of this, like the sergeant turns and says, everybody get back in your house. If we've got to come back, we're arresting all y'all. And we get back in the car and I turned to him and I said, you think that's good? Do you think that helped? He said, oh, definitely not. And I think the reason that I say that is like, you know, as you guys know as well as I do, there is huge skepticism by police departments all over the country about community violence intervention organizations, right? Huge skepticism. And that experience like highlights for me why the cops should love community violence intervention, right? Because it's like, you know, on the south side of Chicago on a Friday night in the summer, it is almost nonstop man with a gun or shots fired calls. Like they're racing from corner to corner dealing with that. They don't have time to bring everybody together, talk about like what happened, how they're, you know, whatever. They don't have the temperament for it. They don't have the time for it. They don't have the training for it. But that's exactly what a CVI organization should do. They should be thrilled rather than coming back 2 hours later and have to have 15 guys deal with a shooting scene and be taken off the street. Why wouldn't you want a CVI group to come in and just try and put a lid on that so you don't have to come back later, right? That's the other. So it's a long way around of saying, like, I think this sort of perspective gives you an understanding of why cops and CVI together like make so much sense as kind of a public safety infrastructure.
Other questions?
So you had said when you have a system two thinking, right, of violent crime, it's a short step to, all right, let's build more prisons and stick people in. With system one, isn't it then a short step that just if we have less guns, we would have a lot less violence? Because maybe you still have kids in the street fighting over a bike, but then it doesn't end in gun violence. It ends in like a fist fight or maybe even someone getting stabbed, but that is objectively better. And so connecting that then with limited resources and the fact that, our gun laws are probably not changing anytime soon, wouldn't it be prudent for police departments to dedicate officer time towards breaking up, right, where the source of these guns are coming from? Because I know in Philadelphia and the surrounding counties in recent years, a lot of straw purchase kind of rings have been broken up, and that's helped some. So is that something that you think is a recommendation that someone could take from your book?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So the Chicago Police Department has, I think, something like 400 or 500 officers assigned to the narcotics team. And if you've seen The Wire, you know how useful our narcotics team is, right? The punchline for The Wire is 30 minutes into the final episode of every season, they take down the gang, the corner is quiet for 15 minutes of the show, and then the last 15 minutes is what a criminologist would call replacement, the corner being repopulated, right? I think if I had to reverse engineer and guess what the police commanders are thinking, it might go something like a lot of the shootings are near drug corners. So if we make a lot of drug arrests, maybe that will somehow, it's like the Far Side cartoon, and then a miracle happens and there's less gun violence. Might be kind of sort of the logic that they have, I don't know. I wrote a paper with Anthony Braga here at Penn and Phil Cook from Duke and Sudhir Venkatesh, the sociologist, many years ago looking at underground gun markets. And one of the reasons that I think underground drug markets are so resilient to enforcement pressure is because drugs are consumables, right? And so it is a very thick market with tons and tons of interactions. Guns, on the other hand, are durable goods. And so the number of transactions that you need in a market is way, way less. And so the illegal market, if you sort of step back and think about it, the hard thing about illegal markets is that you cannot go to Google and find a local drug seller or a local illegal gun seller. So buyers and sellers have to figure out some other way to connect, absent the ability to legally advertise. And with a very thick market like a drug market, there are corners that develop. Right, everybody in Chicago knows where those corners are. I'm sure everybody in Philadelphia knows where the corners are, but they're not corners the same way for the underground gun market. And what we found in our ethnographic study of Chicago is that the gun market in Chicago, it's very thin and it is very creaky. Right, it's very hard for buyers and sellers to connect with one another. There's a set of brokers that'll charge you 40 or 50 bucks to find, if you're a buyer, to find you a seller, right? All of that makes you think why not? This is a long way around of saying, yes, absolutely, amen. And it's a way of saying why don't we take that narcotics team of 400 or 500 officers and redeploy that to worry about the underground gun market instead? I think that would have way more public safety benefit, totally.
To kind of fall on that question, though, I was going to ask, and by the way, he talks about this in chapter 2. But given the just sheer number of guns available in a city like Philadelphia, even that kind of enforcement, is there some reason to have skepticism, though, that it would still have that much of a meaningful effect? Given, if I break into your average house in Philadelphia, there's a good chance there's a handgun. Yeah. I can steal it.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, the way that I don't know if this is a helpful way to think about the problem, but it's there's some problems like polio where you're looking for I hate to say magic bullet, but you're looking for one thing that is going to solve the problem, right? Jonas Salk invents the polio vaccine. Now there's no polio. Well, we'll see. But there hadn't been polio until recently. And we solved the problem with one. I don't think gun violence is going to be something that we are going to solve with the polio vaccine for gun violence. My guess would be that progress is going to come more from a golden portfolio. A bunch of different things that make 5% incremental deltas. And then you accumulate that It's a little bit like the story that public health people say about how motor vehicle deaths went down. It was seatbelts, and it was airbags, and it was collapsible railings on the side of highway, and and drunk driving law, and all of this stuff. All of a sudden, you see these huge reductions. And so, I think repurposing the narcotics team to worry about underground gun markets is not going to end illegal gun availability in Philadelphia or Chicago, but it might get you a 5% delta in shootings, a 3% delta in shootings in a country with I think in Chicago we have something like 3,000 or 4,000 shootings a year, right? That is a lot of families, a lot of communities that are not devastated. Why not do that?
Great. Other questions?
Thank you. Hi, I'm in the Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences program, so this is just fascinating. Really appreciate you coming here and speaking. I was wondering, you focused mostly on juvenile interventions. Do you see a difference in the efficacy of juvenile interventions versus adults? And if so, do you have kind of an understanding of why?
Yeah, I think what you might be driving at is the neuroscience says that the executive functioning part of the brain is not fully baked until the mid-20s. And so maybe we've done some of these programs with guys at very elevated risk for gun violence involvement in their 20s and 30s and seen encouraging results. I think the biggest challenge, has really been delivery settings and getting engagement, right? And the great thing about youth programs is schools are a terrific touch point to deliver services to kids. When we did this, it's a study of, there's a nonprofit in Chicago called Heartland Alliance. The READY program in Chicago is the one that we worked on. In order to get 20 and 30 something guys to participate, we had to give them a job as a big carrot to get them to participate, which is, we should be worried about solving poverty for its own sake, right? But that turns out to make the program super expensive and hence really hard to scale and deliver to lots of people. And I think that's the big, and so I think in a world in which we have no money, it seems to me the place to start to reach adults would be jails and prisons. Detention facilities are places where there's a lot of low value time currently. And we have people at elevated risk for gun violence involvement, either as victims or offenders. Why aren't we, for starters, working on that? That just seems like a total no-brainer to me.
Page 73, you have the age crime curve. I assume that also might be some relevance.
I tried to patent that, and they told me someone had discovered it before.
So it seems like the benefits would accrue from focusing on adolescents and young adults, or people kind of at the peak of, whether it's gun offending or other violence.
Maybe the one other thing that I would say about adults is if you can't mentally simulate the age crime curve in your head, it's it peaks in late adolescence, but it's got a long right tail.
Yeah.
Right? It's got a long right tail. And if you integrate under the age crime curve, for people above ages 18 and above, that's where most of the per year rate is highest among adolescents, but the large majority of shootings are people over 18. And it's, so partly it's the contact point that I mentioned, but the other big public policy challenge this raises is the social safety net. We understand that we need schools for kids. That's the huge social program for kids. And we have a bunch of social programs for women and children more generally. But the social safety net in the United States overall assumes that working age men will be working. And it's working age men who are the ones who are disproportionately victims and offenders. And so cities now are trying to figure out how to solve this problem without a dedicated sort of federal funding source or any funding source for that population, right? And I think that is kind of I think some states are now trying to get Medicaid waivers where they can use Medicaid dollars to help fund what they call behavioral health interventions. They look a lot like this sort of stuff. So maybe that will help us make some progress, but I think that is a core, but there are gonna be lots of states that aren't gonna do that. I think that is kind of core hole in like a core funding hole that makes all of this super, super hard to do at scale for. And again, like why the detention thing, there are lots of reasons why you would want to help people before they wind up in detention. If we had a dedicated funding stream, we could do that. At the very least, as a second best, let's make sure every time someone winds up at a detention facility, we do everything that we can to make sure they don't come back. Because that's not just good for society, but it's good for them as well.
Is there any question, any other questions from the audience? Yeah, another one.
And so I'm an African-American male, and I've been working on wellness, healing, mindfulness, and forgiveness. Now here you come with this whole idea of unforgiving. So what do I do? How do I grapple with, I'm trying to forgive white people, my parents, the police, and now you're saying unforgiving. So where do I go with this in terms of unforgiving?
So the argument of the book, is that we as a society have created a bunch of unforgiving places, right? Like there are neighborhoods all over the south side of Chicago, just to take one small example. There are neighborhoods all over the south side of Chicago where there is almost no place that you could buy a bottle of water, much less grocery shop, much less whatever. And so Jane Jacobs would have been able to tell you 65 years ago, there aren't going to be people walking around going, there aren't going to be eyes on the street in a community like that, and on and on. I think if you look at the survey data, most Americans would say, I have no idea why you idiots in the universities would think that zoning has anything to do with gun violence. It's about either about like ending root causes or locking people up. And this doesn't look like either one of those. And so what I hope the book does is shift people's thinking and expands their thinking about ways in which lots of things that sit totally outside the criminal justice system as well might be, including the stuff that you and many, many other people are doing around the country, are actually really important, but don't obviously connect to this conventional wisdom that everybody's been walking around with for like 100 years. So.
Are we able to take, or is there online questions too, or no? No, okay. All right, well, Dave, you have one? Yeah.
Thanks, Jens. That's very interesting. I look forward to reading the book. Want to see if you would apply the same System 1 argument to police violence and what we should do about police violence if you do.
Yeah, great question. So yes, we had some people at our, my University of Chicago colleague, Undrilla Dubé, wrote a paper with Sandy Jo MacArthur, who'd been at LAPD for a long time and developed their training stuff, and Anuj Shah, a guy, a psychologist at Princeton now. And they basically developed BAM for cops. And they did a bunch of training for Chicago police officers that looked a lot like BAM, but tailored to be, I guess the jargony term is culturally competent for cops, right? So the cops wound up liking it, which is good. And then we looked at administrative data, like these are real Chicago cops going out and doing their, like, this is not like outcome data from a lab or whatever. Like this is like actually what the cops do out on the street. And you see big reductions in police misconduct, big particular narrowings in racial disparities in the arrests that the cops make. And you see a reduction in some of the low public safety value arrests that we were like low-level nonsense that the cops were making arrests for periodically, they're less likely to make arrests for now. And so, like, I think this is not to say that there are not people who should not be cops, right? There are definitely people who should not be cops. But as a complement to worrying about that problem, I think that this is like a piece of low-hanging fruit that we should incorporate into every police department's training around the country. It just makes so much sense. Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much again for having me.
Thanks, and we're at time, so thank you all.